All right, welcome back. We are part 2 of chapter 7, talking about persuasion. So, we have already discussed the paths that lead to persuasion. We began in part 1 on the elements. We discussed about who, looking at the communicator and those things that make them more credible and trustworthy and overall would increase likelihood of being persuaded. Now we are going to move on to discussing what and how. And then finally we close out with looking at how can persuasion be resisted. Okay. So if we continue with the elements of persuasion, what is said is what we are looking at here, the message. Question, do we appeal to reason or do we default to emotion? The answer in this class has consistently been, it depends, and here is no different. It honestly depends on the audience. You want to ensure you are providing what will be best received. If you are in a group of professionals, your message should be logical more than emotional, as they are more likely to be looking and thinking with reason. On the other hand, if you are presenting to a group of teens, you go back to your high school, or you're presenting to your peers, then because by nature y'all are just more easily distracted and bored quickly, you would definitely want to play on emotions. Now, good feelings go a long way. It enhances persuasion because good feelings make us think positively, and we usually associate the good feeling with the message. So we feel good, so the message must be good, right? Right. Humor also puts people in a good mood, so it's also a good idea to include humor with the goal of improving mood because this ultimately may improve effectiveness. Now, on the other side, evoking negative emotions, namely fear, can also be effective. These can be potent, but they are limited. So if you scare people and they are left feeling helpless and out of control, and that is out of control from changing or stopping whatever is invoking the fear, then they will adjust and justify their behaviors accordingly. So if we go back one chapter and look at cognitive dissonance, that would likely be what takes place as they feel the angst of the fear of the message and their behaviors, and as such would proceed to adjust. And it wouldn't necessarily be adjusting their behaviors because they don't think they can do anything, so they will adjust their attitude. And so let's say it's a fair appeal for smoking, then it will, everybody got to die some point, and look how many people have not died, etc., etc. So basically, to maximize on your fair tactics, you must provide a message that doesn't only scare the person, but they also can perceive a solution and feel like they can actually implement said solution. All right. So context is going to make a wildly difference in terms of the message and the content. Have you ever walked into the mall, gone to the food court, and you're interested at the people who are walking around with the plates with the samples, and you stand there and you taste a couple samples, and then you decide that you're just going to eat from them? Well, for the majority of us, when we decide to eat from them, it's because we've already gotten something free. And so now we are going to go and spend money there, even if our intent had not been that. And there were times when this has happened, and people would, as soon as I tasted, they would automatically give me the menu as a way to say, here, go and buy, which of course would doubly increase my likelihood to buy from them. So, foot in the door. I offer you a free sample, hand you a menu, and invite you to order. So essentially what is happening here is that we agree to something small, and that gets our foot in the door. And once our foot in the door, we are more likely to acquiesce and say sure for a request that is larger, more expensive, whatever it is. Um, you know, can you drop me home today, please? I just live right up the corner from you. You got to pass my house. Oh, okay, no problem, man, no problem. Hop in the car. Put the seatbelt on, click. Oh, I actually need to stop to the mall before we go home. Now we leave in UB and go in Carmichael. The mall is on the eastern end and taking me out of my way. But because I already dropping you home and I feel, some kind of way, I already say yes to you, I will go to the mall. Now, granted, that's a big stretch. May not be that drastic, but sometimes it does. Lowball technique is another one that you'll find you have experienced likely. And this happens usually in sales. And the best way to explain it is when you have agreed to purchase something at a particular price, and as soon as you get to the cash register, the price increases. It may not increase so significantly that you can no longer afford it, because then that would undermine what's happening, but it increases enough that you end up spending more money than you had actually agreed to. And you are more likely to comply because you have already agreed to purchase it. So you've already gone up. If you remember from the chapter before with attitudes and behaviors, once we publicly say something, we commit to something, we are more likely to follow through. And so it's similar here. So people lowball you. So they get you to agree to something knowing that it's going to cost more. Don't tell you what the full cost is until you get to the place where you've already said, fine, I want it. And so you're just willing to buy it. Now, the door in the face technique is always another one that you students like because you've used it before. And essentially, this is where you ask for something that is so outrageous that the person has to be like, no, which is the equivalent of slamming the door in your face. And so once they have said no, then you're like, oh, okay, so you don't have $100. All right, then can I just get 30? And, that person then, because they feel some kind of way because they've already declined you the first time. So now this counter offer seems more reasonable. Had I come to you and asked you for $30, I may have still said no, because I remember the last time I lent you $30 and I never got it back. But because you asked for 100 first and now you're asking for 30, I feel, I'm like, okay, fine, I can do that. All right, so let's move on. You may ask, when it comes to convincing somebody of something, do I share only my view, or do I share the opposing side? And the research suggests that if the audience is going to hear both sides anyway, then you definitely want to include counter arguments in your message. So, if there's a lineup of individuals and you know for sure somebody has an opinion or a pitch that is opposed to yours, then you definitely want to present theirs. However, if your message is all that people are going to get and it is not likely that they're going to go and do any Google to find, they're not going to Google anything to find another view of it, then it's all good. Just keep your information and just present that. By presenting both sides, especially when they hear both sides or they're going to hear both sides, it does make you seem credible, trustworthy, and honest. All right, the big question: do you speak first or do you speak last? Now, we know that what is presented first, primacy effect, when all things are equal, the first thing that we hear is the thing that we hold on to. This may be because we lose interest after a couple have to go deeper into the message, or it may be because whatever was said first appealed to us and we connected with it. But that tends to be the case. First in is the one we hold on to. However, on the flip side, there is grounds and there is research that shows that information that's presented last also can be the thing that sticks and has the most influence. So there are both options in terms of message content. You want to make sure then that if you are giving something, you're making your pitch, that you start with your position and you end with it so that they hear it both times and it is able to stick. Now, let's say you have an option of where you are going to speak. So it's less about the positioning of your argument and it's more about your position and your argument in a long line of speakers. You want to understand how primacy works versus recency effects. Primacy effects works best when the messages are back to back and there is a delay before there is a response or a decision needed. So everybody presents, and then a week or two, a month later, then you make the decision. On the other hand, the recency effects become most salient and most potent when messages are separated by some time. So one set of messages are presented today, another set are presented next week, and then you make the decisions. The voting occurs, let's say, on the day after the second set of messages are made. So in that instance, what was heard last, because it is immediate to the decision, the deciding point, is going to be the thing that sticks. All right, so if we summarize what's going to be effective for the what, and the message when we are being persuasive, you want to consider both logic and emotion because both can be effective. But to decide, you must know your audience and you have to assess your message. You ask a small favor before you make a big request, and that gives you an in rather than if you just make a big request straight up. You offer two-sided messages that challenge arguments against your message because it makes you look trustworthy and reliable. You want to go first or you go last, never in the middle if you actually want to be remembered. Okay, so now let's switch gears. Let's talk about how it is said. So these are the channels of communication. For persuasion, there must be communication. And for communication, there must be a channel. The three ways discussed here are face-to-face, a written sign, or a document, or a media advertisement. We tend to put much faith in written words, but it's not always the most effective. It is just way too passive. So when we look at multimedia and other experiences, it is going to be easier for us to convince others of something if we get them engaged rather than just sharing messages. So when somebody is doing or participating, this is a stronger connector. And along those lines, if you think about campaigns that are most impactful, it's going to likely be the ones that you've been exposed to in multiple ways and multiple times. I will never forget my 6-year-old and her comment. Now, funny enough, going back to how memory can't be trusted, I cannot remember the context of this, but what stood out to me was at the end of the conversation, she says, "Why wouldn't they just take the things to superwash?" And I was like, interesting. Why wouldn't they? And what happened was I realized she's familiar with superwash, not because we go to the laundromat, because we have a washer and dryer at home. And even when it was broken, we used to go to my puppy house. But because the radio station that I listen to plays a superwash commercial very clearly, very often. And the message is repeated over and over. A superwash washes you, cleans you 24/7. And so for her, when there was a dilemma and it had to do with dirty laundry, it just made sense that we should go to superwash. The power of repetition to getting your message out there. Now, when we think about channel of communication again, modern selling often strives to use more word of mouth because it is our contact with people, not the media, that has a major influence. So you want to create a buzz, get people talking about your product, your service, your philosophy. You want to convince someone of something, let them hear it from someone else or see somebody else doing. Now, with that said, we should not underestimate the influence of media. And if you look at you reference your text and you see the two-step flow of communication, we see that media whose influence often occurs through opinion leaders who in turn influence others. So it's a two-step. So from the media to someone who is deemed important, an influencer, and then that person then influences others. Opinion leaders are seen as experts. In the recount of the Fire Festival, they talk about the amount of money that was spent to get influencers talking about and creating a buzz about the festival. They didn't even need to show up, but it was just the idea that they were going to promote it that was sufficient to get others to buy in, build hype, and really just get energy around the coming event, especially because it was a new one. The text talks about those who are removed from TV still being lured by the messages promoted on TV because media infiltrates personal contacts. So again, this two-step communication occurring. And so even if you are not tuned into TV, For example, going back to my 6-year-old again, even though she may not necessarily watch certain stations that would introduce certain characters and their dolls and stuff like that, she would still know about them because her friends, who are for her influencers, are talking about them and introducing them to her. So we cannot downplay the value of the media. Now, um, when it comes to messages that are more difficult to comprehend, you want to put it in writing so that the people that you are trying to inform can read it on their own and comprehend. So even though written is a passive form, if the content is going to be more difficult, then it is still going to be a strong way to persuade someone. And finally, we look at the influence of parents or really adults on children. And it is true that we learn most of our values and such from our parents, but a word to the wise is that parents and adults, when it comes to influencing children, do not need to say too much. And I don't even need to explain it because you would have experienced it in your own lives. Pretty much whatever your parents said, you then felt you should do the opposite of. So it is good for it to be there, but not to the extent that it's over and over and over. Okay, and if you could stay with me a little longer with my congestion and my nasally voice, I'm going to be out of your way soon. So, 2 audience characteristics that you want to consider: age and thoughtfulness. In particular, do not underestimate age when you are creating a campaign. You need to ensure that your message is crafted to the age, the target audience. And this is for a number of reasons. They have the life cycle explanation where we see that attitudes may change as people grow older. But then on the flip side, the one that most of us may actually see is the generational gap, where because attitudes tend to be so stable and across our lifespan, the older people hold on to the things that they've always believed. And then the younger people who are getting new messages and new information as they are forming their attitudes and beliefs, they are getting the new and holding on to those new ones, and as such there is a difference in terms of attitudes and opinions between one generation from the next. And so you have to be aware of this when you are crafting messages. And so speaking of awareness, the degree of thoughtfulness is important. The crucial aspect of the central route of persuasion is not the message, but the response it evokes. And unfortunately, if a message causes us to think of contrary arguments, we are much less likely to disregard it. We are much more likely to disregard it. And why? Because messages that evoke good, favorable thoughts are most effective for persuading. I've said this already, and this is from the idea that if the message is good, it makes us feel good, then we must believe that it is good. So if the message feels bad or makes us feel bad, then we disregard it. Okay, so what you have to keep in mind: 1, you have the upper hand if you are prepared with alternative scenarios and points when you decide to present an argument. You can also keep people moving along without counter arguments if you balance your message with other peripheral cues that keeps them distracted from the core message. For example, take a look at this Involta commercial. 3, be careful with audiences that are bored or distracted. They will lean only on these peripheral cues, and while that may be helpful in some instances, in others it may not be. So on the flip side, there are going to be types of people who are more thinkers and will be motivated to use their central route processing, where they think and engage and analyze, and there are going to be others who are leaning heavily on the peripheral cues. So you need to know how to balance that and how to manage that. Okay, now we're wrapping up. Let's look at how we can resist being influenced. Although being persuaded comes naturally, we can resist being influenced by rethinking habitual responses to authority, seeking more information, and questioning the things that we don't understand. So, best example for this, we tend to defer to authority in this culture, particularly here in the Bahamas. If somebody has a particular title or position, we then automatically assume them to be the expert and that they know what they're talking about. And while sometimes this is the case, it never hurts for you to ask more questions, for you to seek more information. Sometimes you ask the person directly for clarity and for them to explain, and other times you go and you find more information because you know what? It's 2019 and Google is still free. What a time to be alive. So let's do it. You want to not kind of just be persuaded by everything that comes up, then you have to be aware of these things and, ask questions, stop yourself, and just really take stock, get more information. And if you're uncertain, again, ask more questions until you understand. And then finally, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I'm going to direct you to the studies presented and the summaries about attitude inoculation, which was very fascinating stuff. The studies that presented were looking at inoculation in children in a couple different scenarios, and those are, like I said, really interesting work. All right, that is all. I'm hoping this recorded because this is my fourth time now. Anyway, see you all in class.